Have you ever wondered when knitting was invented? Or what was the single greatest innovation in all of knitting history? Today, I'll be talking about the surprising history of knitting. I'll be showing the progress on my Storm Slipover Jr by Petite Knit, and I'll also be demonstrating how to do backwards or mirror knitting, which hopefully will save you all tons of time. I'm Phoebe. I'm a knitter in London, and I wanted to show you the progress on my Storm Slipover Jr. So here it is. This is a textured knit pattern by Petite Knit, and I'm a relatively new knitter. I only started knitting when I was pregnant with my baby, and she's still kind of like a baby now. And when I saw these kinds of patterns, I was so intimidated. I was like, oh, it'd be amazing if I could ever knit like that. It just looks so intricate and complicated. And I picked up this pattern because I thought, oh, this is kind of an easy way to get into texture knitting. And I realized that it's literally just knits and purls, and just in alternating patterns. And so that was really cool to find out that I can make something that looks so complicated. And but as I've been knitting, I've been thinking about the history of knitting and when knitting was invented. And so I started looking it up, and I was totally blown away. To give you some context, I looked at the history of other handicrafts like sewing and pottery and weaving, and I found out that the very first evidence of sewing is from about 50,000 years ago. So archaeologists have discovered bone needles, and they think that human beings use animal sinews, and they sewed with the bone needles. The first ever discovered pottery is from Japan, and those are dated from 16,000 BC. So that's 18,000 years ago. The first woven items are from 10,000 BC. Okay, so I mean, all these handicrafts, these are tens of thousands of years old. Okay, how old do you think knitting is? Actually, knitting is only 1,000 years old. So compare that to pottery, which is 18,000 years old, or weaving, which is about 12,000 years old. Knitting is only 1,000 years old, making it a relatively new craft, perhaps the most modern craft of all. I'm not sure, we have to look at that. I don't know about crochet, I'll have to look into that. And to give you some context, I live in London, and recently I did a day trip to Canterbury. I've lived here for ages, and Canterbury is only an hour away by train. So it was a trip I should have done a long time ago. But it was a beautiful day. It's the quintessential English town. You walk through these cobblestone streets, and it was so amazing. Like when you turn a corner, you literally turn a corner, you enter into the courtyard of the Canterbury Cathedral, and you're just like confronted with this amazing edifice. It's huge and it's totally impressive. I mean, I think the whole point of constructing the cathedrals like on that scale, it was to kind of like inspire people with the awesomeness of God, you know, something like that. And then I looked at the sign, and the sign said Canterbury Cathedral was founded in 597 AD. So that building was begun in 597 AD. And so human beings could build like these amazing buildings, and they couldn't even knit. So like, I mean, even to give you more context, more perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built in 2500 BC. So that would be like 3,500 years. So that was 3,500 years before people could knit. The Colosseum was built in 80 AD. So that was 1,000 years before people could knit. That all said, there is a craft that's kind of like the precursor or the predecessor to knitting, and that's a craft called Nalebinding. It's Norwegian, and I don't know Norwegian, but it's similar to knitting, but it only needs one needle. So you use one needle and you put loops around it, and you put it's loops within loops. But it's different because you don't use continuous yarn. You use short lengths of yarn. It's also like the resulting fabric is also quite dense and not very elastic. But if you look at the garments, they look very similar to knitting. And so So our ancestors did have something similar to knitting. But the very first knitted artifact ever found was found in Egypt, and it's from the 11th century. Scholars, though, they say that knitted garments, they decompose rather quickly, and so it's hard to say when knitting was really first invented, and so they kind of give a generous assessment that it's between the 3rd century and the 11th century, which I think is a really long period of time. But that all said, I think it's amazing that knitting is so recent. So knitting actually got spread in Europe in the Middle Ages, and it became accessible to the masses during the Industrial Revolution. But the single greatest innovation to knitting happened about 500 years after the advent of knitting. So it took about 500 years. And you know what that single greatest innovation was? It was the invention of the purl stitch. So isn't that amazing? It took about 500 years for people to figure out that if you just move the yarn forward and make loops, forward, then your knitting wouldn't curl anymore. So up to that point, everyone's knitting curled, which I find really funny. Okay, another caveat that I think everyone's knitting in Europe curled, because archaeologists have also said that in the knit socks, I believe, found in North Africa, there's some evidence of short row shaping, and they say that it probably necessitated some purling. And so maybe purling was just kind of confined to North Africa and never spread to Europe, because there's no evidence of purling at all until 1562, where Eleonora of Toledo makes some stockings, and there's evidence that she uses purl stitch. And so, this means that other people were doing it before her. So somewhere in the 16th century, Europeans discover purling. And so today we can make these kinds of garments and do all kinds of cool things in our knitting. Okay, that all said, I wanted to demonstrate, so speaking about purling, I wanted to demonstrate a way that I purl quicker, and that is backwards knitting or mirror knitting. So let me get a swatch. I'm swatching up for a hat. This is a yarn from Make. It's Aran weight yarn, and it's a color Cowabunga, which I think is a totally cool name for a color, because I'm from the 80s, and I like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But here's a swatch, and I'm at the end of a knit row, okay? Okay, so I'm finishing up my last 3 knit stitches, and with backwards knitting, you don't have to turn the work, okay? So I'm facing the right side. So with regular purling, you would just turn the knitting around, and then I would start purling this way, right? Like either a throw or I usually do continental, okay? But in backwards knitting, you just keep looking at the right side of the work, and then instead of maneuvering the right needle, you just maneuver the left needle. So you put the needle through that back loop, and then I wrap the yarn around my right pinky, and then I just loop it over. Okay, so through the back loop, and then do you see? I just go like that. So easy. And I actually timed myself doing this. And on my Storm Slipover Jr. project, I could purl, continental style. I could do 10 stitches in 30 seconds. Using this method, I could purl 10 stitches in 25 seconds. So I think, 5 seconds for every 10 stitches, it adds up. It actually saves me quite a lot of time. Let me show you with circular knitting. So back to my Storm Slipover. Okay, so I'm on a purl row right now. So regular purling, right? Like let me stand up for this. Oops. So yeah, there we go. Go like this, I'd purl. Okay. But for backwards knitting, so I'm facing the right side of the work right now, but I would just turn it around this way, okay? And I would just be manipulating my left hand, okay? So I change the yarn to my right hand, and then I just go through the back loop, and then I just loop it over. And I have to say, honestly, I would dread purling. Every time I love knitting, and I get to purl, I'm just inside there's a little sigh. And so when I discover this, I was so happy. And the reason I discovered this, and it's kind of funny because it actually like is how I guess relates to how I got into knitting. It was during the pandemic, and I just needed a hobby that I could just do inside. I was also pregnant with my second baby, and I couldn't sew anymore. It was just like too much trouble to like get sewing machine out, all those things. And so I decided to knit because I just love the way knit things look. And so I just learned everything online. And being left-handed, I think I just assumed that because I'm left-handed, everything always has to kind of be kind of special or different for me. And so I just looked up left-handed knitting, and I found all these left-handed knitting tutorials. And so I learned left-handed knitting, not knowing that I didn't really need to learn it that way. But anyways, I learned it that way, and it was fine. I did a scarf. It was totally fine. And then I started doing a hat, and then I had to do decreases, but then nothing worked because I was doing everything backwards. And so things were like, yeah, everything was just off. And so I just decided to relearn knitting all over again. But then, because I had learned left-handed knitting, when I heard about backwards knitting, I was like, oh, I could totally do that. And so I looked up a tutorial, and I realized like this is a little different than backwards knitting. In left-handed knitting, you're manipulating the needle with your left hand. And so, anyway, so I kind of already had that skill. And so, yeah, I learned backwards knitting. Voila, purling is so much easier, so much faster, and I love this technique. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. Maybe you already knew the technique. Maybe you already knew some of the history, but I found it really fun to get into the history of knitting. I'm going to do another video about why knitting is so recent in modern history, like why it's such a recent craft in modern history. Sorry, why it's such a modern craft in history. And I hope you'll join me for that. So see you next time. Bye.